Shivering through winter in the 1960s wasn't an option, but cranking up the heat wasn't always affordable either. With thin insulation and high heating costs, people had to rely on clever, low-cost tricks to stay warm. Here are the most effective cheap tricks they used to stay warm. In the 1960s, wood stoves were far more than just a heat source. They were a lifeline during the colder months, especially in rural communities where central heating systems weren't always an option. These cast-iron wonders were valued for their reliability. When the power went out, the stove kept burning. There was no need to panic, just stoke the fire and wait for the warmth to fill the house. For those with the privilege of having one, it was often the heart of the home. People cooked meals, dried clothes, and even heated water for washing, all while the fire crackled away. The beauty of the wood stove was that it didn't require fancy technology, just a little know-how and a lot of resourcefulness. People didn't just buy wood, they collected fallen branches, split logs, and made sure to maximize every inch of the stove. When firewood ran low, corn cobs, scrap lumber, or any leftover timber became fair game. Nothing went to waste. At night, the stove's warmth provided comfort in more ways than one. Families huddled around it, telling stories, doing homework, or simply enjoying each other's company. But it wasn't all cozy chats. Someone was always on firewood duty. When winter arrived in the 1960s, layered clothing became the go-to solution. And it wasn't just a fashion statement. It was practical. People quickly learned that the more layers you wore, the more heat you trapped close to your body, and that heat stayed there. In homes without central heating, it was the easiest and cheapest way to stay warm, and it didn't involve a single fuel bill. Wool was the fabric of choice for many, especially sweaters and socks, as it traps heat while allowing the skin to breathe. And those hand-knit scarves? Not just a winter accessory, but a critical piece of the warmth puzzle. The colder it got, the more layers people added. Shirts, vests, sweaters, and even those thick quilts were thrown on top as a last line of defense. Of course, layering wasn't limited to just adults. Kids learned early on how to pile on enough clothing to survive their walks to school. With families often sharing one or two heat sources in the home, it was common to see everyone dressed in layers, sometimes even indoors. It wasn't unusual to see a whole family looking like they were preparing for an Arctic expedition just to sit down for dinner. The warmth of the stove was great, but warmth from layers was immediate. In the 1960s, when central heating was either a luxury or non-existent in many homes, one of the simplest and most effective ways to keep warm was closing off unused rooms. In homes with a single stove or fireplace as the primary heat source, it made no sense to let precious warmth escape into empty spaces. So families became experts at using what they had, closing doors to rooms they didn't need to use. It was a no-nonsense approach that conserved energy and kept the home cozy. Resourcefulness played a big role in this process. Do-it-yourself fixes like draping thick blankets over doorways or using towels to seal gaps were common. If you couldn't afford fancy draft stoppers, a rolled-up blanket or old clothes did the job just as well. It wasn't about having the best equipment. It was about making do with what was available. This practice quickly became a family routine. Kids were enlisted to help close off rooms before bedtime, and parents made sure to check that all unused spaces were properly sealed. It was a team effort, a small but important part of maintaining a warm and comfortable home during the cold months. Weather stripping doors became one of the most essential home improvements during the 1960s, especially for families who couldn't afford to let precious heat slip away. In homes that lacked modern insulation, every gap or crack around a door was like a welcome mat for the cold. People knew if they didn't seal these openings, they were essentially heating the outdoors. Preventing heat from escaping was just as crucial as generating it, and weather stripping was a simple, low-cost fix. DIY approaches to weather stripping were born out of necessity. Families used anything they could find: old fabric, newspapers, even strips of cloth stuffed into cracks. Of course, for those who could afford it, they'd buy pre-made weather stripping materials, but most people turned to ingenuity. It didn't matter how fancy the solution was as long as it worked. The goal was always the same: stop the cold from getting in and keep the warmth locked inside. Every fall, the whole household would pitch in, checking every door, window, and even the baseboards for potential leaks. It wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. Over time, families came to rely on weather stripping as one of the easiest and most cost-efficient ways to maximize their home's warmth without cranking up the heat. Wood-burning fireplaces were the quintessential heating method in many homes during the 1960s. These classic fixtures were essential in keeping families warm when temperatures plummeted. In homes without central heating or modern space heaters, the fireplace was the focal point of every winter day, a reliable source of warmth that had been used for centuries. Resourcefulness was key when it came to fueling these fireplaces. Firewood wasn't always easy to come by, so families got creative. It wasn't uncommon to see people scavenging for fallen branches, cutting down trees from their own land, or even collecting scrap lumber from construction sites. Anything that could burn was fair game. And when firewood became scarce, families would stockpile wood in advance, using every bit of space to store their seasonal supply. But wood-burning fireplaces were also about more than just heat. They were social hubs, places where families gathered around, sharing meals, playing games, or even doing homework by the firelight. The warmth from the flames had a way of bringing everyone together. Draft stoppers may not be glamorous, but they were an essential, low-cost solution for families trying to conserve heat in the 1960s. These simple devices were placed at the bottom of doors or windows to prevent cold air from sneaking in and warm air from escaping. With many homes lacking modern insulation, every crack and gap was an opportunity for the cold to creep in, so draft stoppers became a must-have for every home during the winter months. Making your own draft stopper was an easy DIY project that required minimal skill but maximum practicality. People used old fabric, towels, or even newspapers stuffed into a piece of cloth, creating a makeshift barrier against the chill. In a time when energy conservation was less about fancy technology and more about personal effort, families got creative. You could find draft stoppers in just about every home, often made with whatever scraps were lying around. Sometimes they were even personalized, embellished with old buttons or sewn with colorful thread. While it might not have been the most glamorous home improvement, draft stoppers were part of a family routine. Everyone pitched in to check doors and windows, ensuring no cold air got past their defenses. Heavy curtains were more than just a decorative touch in the 1960s. They were a vital barrier against the cold. With homes often lacking modern insulation or central heating, every little bit of warmth mattered. The simple act of drawing thick, heavy curtains across windows helped block out drafts and prevent precious heat from escaping. It's said that the right curtains could make a room feel at least 10 degrees warmer, nothing to sneeze at when temperatures plummeted outside. Resourcefulness was key in creating these insulating window coverings. Many families didn't run out to buy expensive drapes. Instead, they used whatever fabric they could get their hands on. Old blankets, quilts, or even denim fabric were turned into makeshift curtains. At night, the family routine often involved drawing the heavy curtains as a way to trap warmth inside. This practice was about conserving energy and minimizing the heating load. Closing the curtains early helped keep the heat in longer, especially when the stove or fireplace was working overtime. Heavy curtains weren't just a family task, they were a community effort. Neighbors swapped tips on where to find good fabric, and friends would sometimes help each other sew curtains for the upcoming season. A thick wool sweater in the 1960s was an essential piece of winter gear, as vital as a heater on a frigid day. For families trying to stay warm without cranking up the heat, wool became the fabric of choice. Not only was it incredibly effective at trapping body heat, but it was also durable and relatively affordable. Wool fibers are naturally insulating, keeping warmth close to the body even in the coldest of homes. Resourcefulness was key, and many people didn't wait for a store-bought sweater. Instead, they learned to knit their own or repurpose old wool garments. Grandmothers and aunts often passed down the skill of knitting, making sure that every family member had a warm sweater. In homes with limited heating, people often wore wool sweaters indoors, layered over shirts and under blankets. With the combination of good wool, thick socks, and a cozy fire, families could survive the harshest winters without relying too much on expensive heating. Whether hand-knitted or store-bought, these sweaters were a warm hug in fabric form, a tangible way of keeping your loved ones safe from the cold. Layered socks and slippers were a quiet hero in many homes during the 1960s, offering an effective way to combat the winter chill. Cold feet can make the entire body feel like it's frozen, and when your only source of heat is a single wood stove or fireplace, keeping your toes warm was no small feat. Families learned quickly that layering up was essential, not just for your arms and torso, but for your feet too. Wool socks were a staple, but it wasn't uncommon to see multiple pairs stacked up on one's feet. A thick pair of wool socks over a thinner cotton pair created a double layer of insulation that trapped heat and kept it close to the body. As for slippers, they were more than just a comfortable choice. They were the final barrier against the cold floors. Wool-lined slippers were particularly popular for their warmth, but even hand-knit slippers made from old yarn were just as effective. Resourcefulness played a big role. Many families didn't rush to the store for new items when the cold set in. Instead, they repurposed what they had. Hand-me-down socks were common, and knitted slippers were often a family craft, passed down through generations. Layered socks and slippers might have seemed simple, but they kept families comfortable and cozy in the harshest of winters. Portable heaters were the unsung heroes of many homes in the 1960s, small but mighty when used wisely. For families with limited budgets, these compact devices provided a cost-effective way to heat individual rooms without cranking up the central furnace, which was often inefficient or non-existent. Whether electric or kerosene, portable heaters became essential tools for targeted heating. They allowed families to focus warmth on the rooms that mattered most, like the living room or bedroom, while conserving energy in areas that weren't being used. Resourcefulness was key to making portable heaters work. People didn't always have the latest models. Sometimes these devices were old and required some maintenance. Families would repurpose old stoves or kerosene heaters, cleaning and fixing them to get the most out of their heat. Even space heaters that ran on electricity were carefully monitored, ensuring that they only ran for short bursts to avoid an electric bill nightmare. Families would gather around portable heaters, using them as a focal point for evening activities. Whether it was reading, playing cards, or talking about the day, these small but effective tools became a gathering place in their own right. Newspaper window insulation may sound like something out of a survivalist handbook, but in the 1960s, it was an ingenious solution for families trying to conserve heat. With drafty windows allowing cold air to seep in, people turned to what they had in abundance: newspapers. It wasn't a glamorous fix, but it worked surprisingly well. People would carefully tape or tack old newspapers to their windows, creating an extra layer of insulation that helped keep the cold at bay. In homes where energy costs were a major concern, this free, readily available material became a winter staple. It wasn't the prettiest solution, but in a time when every penny counted, functionality always trumped fashion. And let's face it, who didn't appreciate the sound of rustling newspaper as you sat cozy indoors while a snowstorm raged outside? Families used newspaper insulation on windows, doors, and even under drafty baseboards, ensuring warmth was trapped inside as long as possible. It was a family affair. Everyone pitched in, especially when it was time to peel off the paper come spring. Rugs and carpets were a vital part of winter preparedness in the 1960s, especially for families trying to keep the cold from seeping into their bones. Cold floors have a way of drawing heat out of the body faster than you can say frostbite. And for homes without central heating, that floor-to-body heat transfer was a real problem. In many households, the resourceful approach was to cover every inch of the floor with whatever rugs or carpets were available. If store-bought options were out of the budget, families turned to do-it-yourself solutions, creating rugs from old fabric or even repurposed blankets. Handcrafted quilts were sometimes laid out to cover cold wood floors, and fabric scraps were sewn together to create makeshift carpets. These homemade versions may not have been stylish, but they sure were effective. The cultural practice of rugging up was passed down from family to family. It was something everyone participated in, especially the kids, who would race around placing rugs in every room and making sure the cold floors were covered before the family settled in for the night. Proper fireplace maintenance was a crucial task in the 1960s, especially for families relying on their hearths to stay warm. A clean chimney meant a more efficient fire, which translated directly into a warmer home. If the chimney was clogged with soot or debris, it could block airflow, leading to inefficient heating, smoke backups, and even dangerous house fires. Keeping the fireplace and chimney clean was as much about safety as it was about comfort, and this was a task taken seriously by every homeowner. Resourcefulness came into play when it came time to clean the chimney. While professional chimney sweeps were available, many families opted to tackle the task themselves. They'd climb onto the roof, armed with brushes, rods, and sometimes just a lot of elbow grease. In a time when people didn't have the luxury of calling a specialist for every minor repair, maintaining the fireplace was often a DIY job. Chimney cleaning became a family tradition, with everyone pitching in. Kids might help gather firewood or keep the hearth tidy, while the adults took care of the actual cleaning. The cleaner the chimney, the better the fire, and the warmer the house. Hot water bottles may seem like a simple solution, but in the 1960s they were a low-tech but highly effective way to warm up a cold bed. When central heating wasn't an option, or when the furnace was too expensive to run all night, these humble bottles filled with hot water offered comfort in the most straightforward way. The trick was to fill the bottle before bed and place it under the blankets to preheat the bed, ensuring warmth when it was needed most. The real beauty of hot water bottles lay in their resourcefulness. Families didn't have to worry about expensive electricity bills or running out of fuel for the fireplace. Instead, all they needed was a pot of hot water and a rubber bottle, two things that were easy to come by. And since the bottles could be reused night after night, they were an economical choice for stretching the family's resources. In homes where heating was a community effort, the whole family played a role. It wasn't unusual for one person to take the task of filling the hot water bottle while another got the beds ready for the night. This small nightly ritual became a comforting routine where everyone contributed to ensuring a warm night's sleep. Knitted accessories became an essential part of the winter wardrobe in the 1960s, not just for their cozy comfort, but for their practicality. Keeping hands, ears, and necks warm can make all the difference in how your body feels in the cold. A knitted scarf, hat, or pair of mittens could be the difference between a cold, miserable winter day and one where you could still go about your business with a little more comfort. Resourcefulness played a key role in how these items were made. Families didn't necessarily run to the store to buy the latest winter gear. Instead, many relied on their own knitting skills. It was common for mothers, grandmothers, or older siblings to pick up needles and yarn to create warm woolen hats, scarves, and mittens for the whole family. It was a DIY effort that saved money and offered a personal touch, often with homemade patterns passed down through generations. Beyond being practical, these knitted accessories became symbols of care. The act of making them wasn't just about warmth, it was a way to show love and attention to those around you. Everyone had a hand-knit hat or scarf, often in vibrant colors or with special patterns that made them feel like home. Cooking heat was one of the most underrated sources of warmth in the 1960s, especially in homes where keeping the house warm was a constant challenge. The kitchen, often the heart of the home, also doubled as the warmest room, thanks to the stove, oven, and constant meal prep. In an era when central heating was not universally available, families learned to maximize the heat generated from cooking. Whether it was a hearty stew simmering on the stove or a roast baking in the oven, the warmth from these meals often spread throughout the kitchen and into the rest of the house. The kitchen became a multi-purpose space, providing warmth, nourishment, and comfort all at once. Resourcefulness was key. Many families would cook meals that took longer to prepare, allowing the heat to build up and fill the kitchen. They also made use of every possible opportunity to cook, whether it was breakfast, lunch, or dinner, just to keep that warmth circulating. Sometimes the oven was left open after baking to let the residual heat escape into the house. Everyone in the family pitched in, from peeling potatoes to setting the table, all while enjoying the warmth radiating from the cooking heat. Residual stove heat was a secret weapon for families in the 1960s trying to stretch every bit of warmth available. After dinner was prepared, many families didn't just turn off the stove and let the heat dissipate. Instead, they would leave the oven door open and let the lingering heat flow into the room. This low-tech but effective strategy helped boost indoor warmth without turning up the thermostat. It was a simple way to make use of every ounce of energy, especially in homes that relied on wood stoves or gas ovens. The kitchen, often the center of family life, became a hotspot not just for meals, but for conserving energy. People knew that keeping the oven door open after cooking could warm the house and save on fuel. It was part of the resourceful spirit of the time, where nothing went to waste, not food and certainly not heat. Families also found creative ways to enhance the heat. Cast iron skillets, once the meal was finished, were often left on the stove to retain and release warmth slowly. The warmth radiating from the stove became an unspoken tradition, where everyone lingered in the kitchen to absorb the last bits of heat from the evening's cooking. Shared body heat became an invaluable source of warmth for families during the 1960s, especially in households where heating was limited or inefficient. When the temperature dropped, the practice of sleeping close together became a practical way to conserve heat. Children often slept in the same bed as parents, and siblings shared space to keep warm throughout the night. The warmth of multiple bodies huddled together helped offset the chill of drafty homes, creating a surprisingly effective natural heater. In many homes, keeping the fire burning all night simply wasn't possible, so families had to get creative. With everyone packed together under thick blankets, the body heat generated was enough to keep the cold at bay, at least until morning. In larger families, the idea of a family bed was a necessity. Resourcefulness also played a part in how families made this work. Parents might pull children closer or adjust bedding to maximize body contact and reduce heat loss. It wasn't uncommon to see homes with multiple mattresses or quilts pulled together in one room to create an insulated sleeping area for the whole family. While this shared warmth may not have been the most private of solutions, it was one of the most effective. Maximizing sunlight was one of the simplest and free ways families in the 1960s kept their homes warm. Before the age of energy-efficient windows or solar panels, the natural heat provided by the sun was an invaluable resource. People took full advantage of the sun's rays, especially during the colder months. By opening curtains or blinds on sunny days, they could allow the warmth from outside to flood into the house, helping to raise the indoor temperature without turning on a single heater. During the day, families would move furniture closer to windows to bask in the sunlight, creating cozy spots by the windowsills. With heat often scarce, a good sunbeam was as precious as a cup of hot cocoa. People also made sure to shut the curtains tightly as soon as the sun went down, trapping whatever heat they had managed to collect. Resourcefulness came into play when it came to maximizing sunlight. Homes were arranged so that windows were kept clean and unobstructed, allowing every ray to shine through. Some people even used reflective materials, like aluminum foil, to bounce light into darker corners, further boosting their efforts. Extra blankets and quilts were the ultimate winter essentials for families in the 1960s, proving that sometimes more really is more. When homes lacked proper insulation or efficient heating, layering up in blankets became the key to staying warm at night. The strategy was simple. The more layers you piled on, the more warmth you trapped. It was an affordable, accessible way to combat the cold without relying on expensive fuel or electricity. Resourcefulness was at the heart of this approach. Families didn't just head to the store for a few extra blankets, they often made their own. Quilts, hand-stitched by mothers or grandmothers, were passed down through generations. Using old clothing, fabric scraps, or even remnants of wool, these homemade quilts weren't just practical, they carried sentimental value. They were proof of a family's ability to make the best out of what they had. In many homes, the evening routine involved making sure everyone was tucked under at least 2 or 3 blankets. Kids might sleep in shared beds, surrounded by their siblings, keeping each other warm. The tradition of using extra blankets became part of the fabric of family life. Do it yourself. Draft curtains became a lifesaver for families in the 1960s, especially for those living in older homes with windows that didn't exactly seal out the cold. a simple, homemade solution to a very real problem. These draft curtains were a cost-effective way to stop chilly drafts from creeping in and warming air from escaping. Whether made from thick fabric, old blankets, or even recycled materials, they were easy to make and even easier to use. Resourcefulness was key when it came to these homemade fixes. In homes where money was tight, buying new curtains wasn't always an option. But with a bit of creativity, families would repurpose whatever fabric they had on hand. Old woolen blankets, worn-out quilts, or fabric scraps from previous projects were sewn into long, heavy curtains that could be hung over windows. The goal wasn't aesthetics, it was functionality. As homes were heated by stoves or fireplaces, it became second nature to check that all the windows were sealed properly before nightfall. Draft curtains became part of the daily routine, an inexpensive yet effective way to conserve heat. They may not have been fancy, but in a time when every bit of warmth mattered, they were nothing short of essential. Homemade insulation was one of the most resourceful solutions for families in the 1960s, trying to keep the cold at bay. When commercial insulation was expensive or simply unavailable, people used whatever materials they had on hand to block out the chill. Cardboard, newspaper, fabric, and even old clothes became makeshift insulators that could be stuffed into cracks around windows and doors or laid out on drafty floors. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. This DIY approach was deeply rooted in the cultural context of the time, where resourcefulness was a necessity. Many families couldn't afford the luxuries of modern insulation or central heating, so they found inventive ways to stay warm. The act of patching up gaps with whatever materials were available wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. It became a daily ritual, checking for drafts and sealing them with anything that would do the job. Community and family bonds often came into play as neighbors helped one another with these home improvements. Whether it was sharing spare blankets, helping install homemade insulation, or swapping tips on the best materials to use, families supported each other in their efforts to keep their homes warm. Heated stones were one of the more creative but limited heating methods families used in the 1960s to fight off the cold. The concept was simple: heat stones in the fireplace or wood stove, wrap them in towels, and then place them in beds or at the foot of chairs to warm up a cold room. This resourceful method was a way to make the most of every bit of heat generated by the fire, particularly when central heating was either too expensive or unavailable. With heating methods often restricted to stoves or fireplaces, any extra heat needed to be harnessed. People quickly realized that heat could be stored in stone, which retained warmth long after the fire had died down. The only issue was that it wasn't long-lasting. Stones could only hold onto heat for a few hours, so their effectiveness was limited to short bursts of warmth during the night or in the early morning. In homes where everyone pitched in to stay warm, heated stones became a family tradition. Parents would place the warm stones in beds before the kids climbed in, ensuring they wouldn't have to endure the shock of cold sheets. It was a small act, but one that carried a lot of warmth in more ways than one. Hot beverages were an essential part of winter survival in the 1960s, warming people from the inside out. Whether it was a mug of tea, coffee, or hot cocoa, these drinks provided a much-needed break from the cold. They didn't just taste good, they offered a quick burst of warmth, especially during long, chilly evenings when the heat from the stove or fireplace wasn't enough to keep the house completely warm. Resourcefulness came into play as families made the most of whatever they had available. Instant coffee, powdered milk, or homemade broths became staples, offering a cheap and easy way to heat up. Even homemade teas made from herbs or dried fruit were a common DIY solution to warming up during the winter months. These drinks not only filled the stomach but provided a comforting ritual, often accompanied by family conversations or stories around the stove. Culturally, hot beverages also became an opportunity for community bonding. Neighbors would share a hot cup together during visits, and family members would gather around the kitchen table, warming both their bodies and spirits. Layered bedclothes were a go-to strategy in the 1960s for families trying to stay warm during the cold nights. With heating often limited to a single stove or fireplace, It was essential to trap as much warmth as possible, and the solution was simple: more layers. People didn't just sleep under one or two blankets. They piled on as many as they could, often including quilts, woolen blankets, and even extra sheets. Each layer acted like an insulating barrier, trapping body heat and preventing it from escaping into the cold night air. Families didn't always have access to high-end bedding, but they were resourceful. Old blankets, hand-stitched quilts, or even fabric scraps were repurposed to create extra warmth for the family. It was an effective, low-cost way to conserve energy, and, like many winter habits, it became part of the daily routine. At night, the whole family participated in the layering process, sometimes even kids helping to spread out the blankets before crawling in. While the effectiveness of layered bedclothes was limited to nighttime, it became a cherished practice, a comforting ritual in the cold months. So the thing about Depression-era cooking was that it led people to places they never thought they'd go to. Previously, we actually discussed in detail how people started using all of the pig. What you probably didn't think was that this meant literally everything. Yes, even the feet. Pickled pig's feet were one of the best things to go for if we're talking about people who drew the short end of the stick during the Depression. Not all economic stress was equal. People that were living in urban hubs, especially the big-name states and cities, had it much better than local towns and rural populations that were struggling to keep going. These parts of the pig, often considered offal, were not sold at market rate prices, and usually were a lot cheaper than other cuts of meat. The thing with those cuts was that even if they were available, which they rarely were since they were also being rationed heavily, they'd leave quite a gap in your budget. Pickling the pig's feet with vinegar and taking advantage of its acidity meant that the meat lasted longer too, and that goes to show you how dedicated people were to getting as much use as they could out of everything they had. It might be named after an opera singer out of admiration for her. After all, Luisa Tetrazzini was one generational voice, but after a few bites of this, you'll be singing too. And it'll be nothing but the praises of a well-made chicken Tetrazzini, which is one of Ernest Arbogast's proudest inventions. Arbogast is a pretty heavy name in the cooking industry both in America and France, so if a dish has his seal of approval, you can be assured about the quality. This one in particular makes use of cooked chicken, mushrooms, a sauce that's usually made from cream, and Parmesan cheese. Throw it in with spaghetti and bake it with a crunchy breadcrumb topping, and you have a full-course meal that you haven't experienced before. Baking with spaghetti with mushrooms and cooked chicken or turkey? To the average American, the mix of flavors seems pretty daunting. And being honest, I don't blame you. It's definitely something I'd raise a curious eyebrow, sure, but also a concerning one. Though there's a reason it held its own even in the 70s, which had a slew of dishes that could steal your heart and wallet. The reason it's so budget-friendly is because you can easily assemble this with leftovers too, which is why it was a really popular way to deal with Thanksgiving leftovers. The ingredients are something you'd find in most pantries, and it doesn't take that much to prepare the dish. All in all, it's a pretty good deal. Hungarian goulash soup is a pretty traditional Hungarian dish. It was actually something that went all the way back to the Middle Ages and was something that would be popular in people and communities with primarily nomadic lifestyles. See, the idea here was to cook the meat with the onions in these oversized kettles over a giant open fire. Sometime later in history, around the 16th century, they also started adding in paprika to it, which pretty much gave goulash its identity as far as its flavor profile is considered. That's also where that really vibrant and vivid red comes from. Now, when Hungarian immigrants brought goulash over to America, it became a middle-class classic. Goulash soup wasn't just a beloved global dish or even something that struggling families in America relied on to get by. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a lot of comfort. Plus, Americans experimented a lot with it. We threw in garlic, all kinds of peppers, and beef. We thickened it and seasoned it, and I mean, sure, it may not be the traditional goulash soup I started describing anymore, but does that make it any less worthy of a comeback today? In a time when heating was expensive and resources were scarce, families during the Great Depression turned to a natural, free source of warmth: the sun. Capitalizing on every sunny moment, they would gather near windows to soak up the heat from the daylight. This wasn't just about enjoying a bit of sunshine, but also a strategy to stay warm and conserve fuel. By sitting close to the glass, people maximized the heat trapped inside, making the most of the sun's natural energy. The role of nature was clear. The sun, when it shone, became a vital part of home heating. On clear days, people would move furniture to optimize sunlight exposure, often taking turns to bask in the warmth. With homes built with larger windows in mind, especially in rural areas, this practice became a clever adaptation of the environment. This practice also fostered family togetherness. On sunny days, households would find themselves gathering in the same room, warming their bodies and spirits. Today, we can take a page from this frugality. Natural heat, though often overlooked in modern times, is still a powerful resource, reminding us that sometimes a little sunlight can go a long way, both in saving money and lifting spirits. Crackling cornbread is a pretty traditional Southern dish that comes right out of the family cookbooks of this decade, so that should tell you something about how much grandmas loved it. Crackling cornbread sounds a lot more climactic than it really is, though, so let's go through what makes it so crackling. Basically, they're made with chicharrones, or otherwise known as pork cracklings. These are crispy fried bits of fat that were rendered when the pork was being cooked, and they most typically come from the fatback or the skin of a pig. Now, one bit of time-specific context that's really important here is that people were using every part of the pig they could back then. Crackling cornbread was another variation of that kind of mentality where people really wanted to not let anything go to waste, especially the pig. Why was the pig so special, though? Well, unlike chickens, ducks, and even beef, the pig was the only animal that had use outside of the plate, too. You could use its bones for broths, you could use its fat for cooking, you could get lard out of it. That's what made this animal so important. And that's why so many dishes like crackling cornbread came out of the South when pigs were commonly being consumed due to the shortage of other options. 7-layer salad, on the other hand, goes back to the greener side of things, and you might get a little intimidated with a name like that. It's no 3-layer cake, as in, you will still be able to eat other things once you're done with this, so don't worry. It's actually this potluck dish that first popped up during the 1950s in the Midwest, and the reason it got that name is because of the way it's set up. Imagine, for just a second, lots of ingredients like iceberg lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, bacon, cheese, and mayo dressing, all layered up one by one in a clear dish. You can now see why the 7-layer aspect caught on. Plus, it wasn't just that this dish was really healthy and flavorful, it got popular for other reasons too. Most of the ingredients I just mentioned were things you could get under $5 total if you didn't already have them lying around. And in the 70s, especially during America's post-war period, people were tired. They were tired of the economy failing and rationing, all struggling to make ends meet. Long story short, they wanted food that was easy to make and prepare. Out with the 2-hour-long lasagnas and meatloaf and in with the salads and sandwiches, I suppose. So now you have a dish that looks good, works with a potluck, and tastes even better. Of course it was going to catch on. And even today, a lot of households that had family recipes passed down still fondly make the dish. Why don't you give it a try the next time you're looking for gut-healthy food? Pho is a Vietnamese icon that has taken its career in being a senior soup choice all the way from northern Vietnam to the streets of any American neighborhood. This dish is characterized by things like a broth you can smell from miles away, the delectable sound of simmering beef bones that remind you of waiting around for mom's cooking, onions that seem fresher and more purple than anything you've ever seen at Walmart, and the warmest spices like cinnamon, cloves, and star anise. The idea to introduce beef to pho wasn't actually how it originally started, but it was something that people liked a lot in America too. The soup's popularity was something that couldn't be ignored throughout America in the 70s and 80s, especially with how many Vietnamese American communities and immigrant populations in general were taking advantage of the current trends of that era. The times back then were all about exploring these new cultures, seeing what they had to offer, and opening the horizons of our taste buds. Which I'm pretty glad for, to be honest. I'd hate to be born in the 2000s when pho wasn't a widely available thing. Faux has now become a mainstream part of American society and is arguably the most suitable winter food. During the Great Depression, staying warm often meant stacking blankets, not just one or two, but multiple layers of quilts and blankets to trap heat. This was an ingenious, straightforward approach to insulating beds without the luxury of central heating or thick comforters. Families would gather every piece of fabric they had, old woolen blankets, quilts passed down through generations, even makeshift covers like cloth sacks or tablecloths, creating a makeshift fortress against the cold. The frugality of this practice couldn't be overstated. Not only did it maximize the warmth of what little bedding they had, but it also ensured that nothing went to waste. Even worn out or damaged blankets were patched together to create additional layers. The simple, layered bedding system was a resourceful solution, leveraging the power of insulation through fabric. Of course, the environment played a role here too. In rural areas, families often had to use what they could find, whether it was sheepskin or fabric scraps, to bolster their layers. This practice also encouraged community bonding. Family members would work together, adding layers to the beds and sharing stories late into the night, wrapped up in warmth and togetherness. Watermelon rind stew isn't something you'd see anywhere today, but it was the talk of the town back in the 1930s. Watermelons, including the rind, are actually pretty wasted. People almost always throw away the rind, and very few actually try to do anything with it. Back in the 1930s, even the rind was used. The green skin on the exterior of the watermelon was something people peeled away, but they'd usually save it to make jelly or something out of it. The rind was also cut into cubes, strips, and whatever else people could find use for. The rind was then cooked and boiled until it was soft enough to be eaten, and it was also salted so that any excessive bitterness could be controlled. Once people did make the rind, they'd add it to the base of a stew that was made from some pretty hands-on ingredients, basically whatever people had lying around. The biggest reason people wanted to use the rind was because it was like really high in water content. It could soak up any kind of seasonings because of that too, which meant that it was easy to give the rind some extra flavor. As unconventional as it was, it meant that a big fruit like a watermelon could be used entirely to maximum benefit. You'd never stop to think cream cheese, grated cheddar cheese, and flavorings like garlic or Worcestershire sauce could be a moment in the culture of American food and eating. Sure, you'd think it was a great meal, but an addictive snack people can't keep their hands off of. Still, don't we all agree that that's exactly what cheese balls were? The cheese balls that we know and love really started popping off in the 1960s to 1970s. They became heavily associated with party culture and the nightlife. You'd see them at bars, cocktail parties, and even as snacks at clubs. Later on, you'd start seeing them all throughout vending machines in pre-packaged forms. But the classic way to make it is something I bet you won't see coming. Did you know they rolled these balls in chopped nuts, like pecans and almonds, then rolled them again in herbs and different spices, ultimately serving them with crackers? That's definitely a flavor you wouldn't find in anything that comes in a packet. Since then, cheese balls have dominated a lot of snack times and post-lunch binge eating in homes all over the nation. They've also been a part of events like how in Philadelphia, a 1.2-pound ball was made for an event about different kinds of cheese. They work with a lot of different flavors that are easy to make in batches, and kids and adults alike go crazy over them. What's not to love here? Minestrone soup actually started out as something that was a vintage ancient Roman heritage dish, and it was supposed to be a very basic, bare-bones type of vegetable stew. This common meal utilized local ingredients that were available, like lentils, grains, and garlic. The word minestrone is actually something that comes from the Italian word minestra, which means soup. However, this particular phrasing of the word refers to a pretty large soup. That ties into how it was prepared and perceived, since minestrone soups were almost always made for working-class families, so that a big batch of food could be prepared and served to everyone. Conveniently eliminate dinner problems for the day, add some nutrition into everyone's diet, and do it all on a budget with no real work? It sounded like a home chef's dream, and it definitely was. Minestrone soup became a symbol of Italian-American heritage, especially with how many of them were bringing their own family recipes and including other things like macaroni and kidney beans. In ancient times, People would use very simple pulses and ingredients because all that was available, but in the 70s and 80s, the nutritional appeal and the availability of all kinds of different ingredients meant that Minestrone Soup saw a comeback. However, in this attempt to add flavor and variety to it, people pretty much diluted the original recipe to the point you couldn't really call it Minestrone Soup anymore, and I think that's why it's a forgotten classic. The bitter cold didn't stop people during the Great Depression from heading outside to work, run errands, or simply survive the day. But with many unable to afford new shoes or even warm socks, an inventive solution emerged: stuffing shoes with newspaper or cloth for extra insulation. It was a simple trick that turned worn-out footwear into a small haven of warmth. Shoes were often patched and repatched to last as long as possible, but keeping feet warm required a little extra creativity. Newspapers were readily available and lightweight, while scraps of cloth could be repurposed from old clothing or blankets. This method demonstrated how even the humblest materials could be transformed into tools for survival. The environment played a role, too, as people used whatever natural or man-made resources were readily at hand. Parents often taught their children how to make the stuffing work best, passing down lessons in both thriftiness and resilience. Today, this simple innovation reminds us that solutions don't always have to be complex or expensive. Molasses, lard, bacon grease, these were the tools of the trade back then. Using them, people made all sorts of things like molasses porridge. Why was this something you wanted, especially over regular porridge? Well, it's simple. In the context of the economic crash out of the 1930s, milk was simply too much for people to afford regularly, and at the exact same time, porridge was something that people needed to eat every day. Molasses porridge was a very cheap dish that could make a big meal out of a small amount of ingredients. It was exactly the kind of thing you would need for a family back in those times, especially when so many families began to live together for fear of running out of resources too quickly. This was especially true for people who had elderly families. Molasses porridge was something that was seen in New England in their rural communities more than anywhere else. The reason porridge helped so much was because you could also add all kinds of scraps, leftovers, and dried fruit to it so that you could make it better. People would also add in stuff like lime, cinnamon, or nutmeg if they wanted to, and that would often make it better. It was first made by chef Philip Romer during his stay at the Palace Hotel in San Francisco, so it's definitely got some backstory with the place. He wanted to make it in honor of the play with the same name. He was a big fan of the main actor in it, George Arliss. Philip thought European sauces were taking over the scene and were too heavy, too narrow. They offered one kind of flavor experience, and he wanted more, so he made something that was more than just that. Did I mislead you into thinking the 70s were all about getting fit and keeping your cholesterol in the ideal range? It was also a period of exploration of other cuisines, one of those being the tiki style of eating. Tiki cuisine had a lot to take inspiration from, don't get me wrong, but one of the best parts of it was Polynesian chicken. Think of it like this sweet and tangy sauce or glaze that blessed the chicken with its thick, rich flavor. Now, the urge to take more steps towards tiki cuisine was something that was building up in the background since the 1930s, but it all really came to a head in the 1970s. In the 1930s, restaurants such as Don the Beachcomber or Trader Vic's would feature popular tiki dishes. This nationwide interest in other cuisines only really exploded as a movement in the 60s and 70s, though, and Polynesian chicken was a big sign of that. It became something you couldn't separate from Mai Tai, like beer and dried fruit at a local pub. However, it wasn't exactly authentic. This American version has pineapple juice, garlic, ginger, soy sauce, and brown sugar-based sauce, and the chicken breast is marinated in that and served with stirred vegetables. The American take on it seems to up the sweetness a lot, but the original tiki variant plays up the tanginess a lot more. Retro tiki parties from the 70s would still have something that really reflected authentic Pacific Islander cuisine, but whichever version you got, you were in for a great meal. Now, before I talk about this, it's going to take both you and me a minute to say the word Avgolemono Soup. This heavy-sounding concoction is a vintage Greek recipe that actually has an incredible amount of things going on with it. So, let's take it from the top. In this bad boy, we have a base of chicken broth, along with some rice. We also have a splendid mix of eggs and lemon juice, and this actually wasn't something the Greeks came up with on their own. It took a lot of inspiration from Sephardic Jewish culinary traditions because the use of mixing citrus fruits with eggs was a big facet of their culture, which was overall really popular in Mediterranean cuisines. This inspired people to temper eggs thanks to the velvety texture it would make. Despite how fancy it sounds, this was actually something Greek people and immigrants in America used to stretch ingredients when times were tough, but they were always of the opinion that a low caliber of ingredients shouldn't result in a low caliber of food, and as a result, this soup punches way above its weight. During the colder months, Avgolemono is a celebrated staple in some communities where Mediterranean cuisine and Greek influences are still pretty prevalent, as few and far as those corners may be in modern America. During the Great Depression, finding enough fuel to keep warm was no easy task. But people living through the hardship didn't sit idly by. They made use of whatever nature had to offer. Scraps of wood, fallen branches, or discarded building materials became valuable resources for heating homes. In rural areas, families would regularly head out to gather firewood from the forest floor, while urban dwellers scavenged through construction sites or abandoned buildings for usable scraps. The ingenuity of these families was remarkable. They knew that every piece of wood could serve a purpose, whether it was used for cooking or simply keeping the house warm. The environment played a huge role in this process. Forests were often the go-to for firewood in rural regions, while in cities, abandoned lots and old fences were repurposed. And it wasn't only the adults who got involved, children helped too, making this a family affair that brought everyone together for a common goal. As modern society grapples with waste and environmental concerns, the Depression-era practice of collecting scrap wood offers a powerful reminder of just how far a little resourcefulness can go in warming both hearts and homes. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, you basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed, and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. You love a good pot pie. I love a good pot pie. They're kind of that one thing that just brings every family member together. Bonds have been mended over a good pot pie, and new ones have been made, especially when the pie tastes as good as a pinwheel steak pot pie. Now, I'm not talking about just any old variation on your typical pie. Let me explain what sets this pie in particular apart from the others. It's all in the pastry dough and how it's wrapped around the steak, sliced into individual rounds, and then baked before being topped with even more pastry. The chef keeps doing this until you have a full-fledged pie, and what you end up with is the quintessential American comfort food experience. This thing got so popular that companies like Swanson were churning out frozen food versions of the pinwheel pie. Don't even get me started on all the restaurants that relied on this for a cash-filled closing on Saturday night. Let's talk about why it's so good, though. You get carrots, peas, a hearty steak made of ground meat, more pastry than you've probably had in a while, steak gravy, and beans to get a savory showstopper. This pie has an extremely rich flavor profile, and nothing about it shies away from that fact. Rather, it embraces its boldness. You know you're in for a heavy meal when you order this. Plus, it didn't help that it looked real pretty too, which made it a great choice for those family gatherings. Cream of mushroom soup was also a European dish that made its way to the shores of the United States and actually managed to pull its weight. Again, this is something people particularly preferred thanks to the simplicity and versatility of cream soups. They can be made with anything, and yes, I do literally mean anything. Also, here's another fun fact you may not be aware of. During the 20th century, thanks to the absolute train wreck that the first half was really just generational work on all accounts by everyone involved, but anyway, during those days, people really began to forage. I mean, they had no money, they had no food, and the table wasn't going to serve itself. People had kids, families to take care of, and lots of responsibilities to rise up to, you know? So they turned to what people always turn to when they have nothing left and nowhere to go: nature. Besides just growing greens in the back of your garden, the average American had also discovered a knack for foraging wild mushrooms. It became a favorite in French and English homes during those times for its earthy taste and simple, easy-to-prepare nature. Now, thanks to brands like Campbell's, which have not only come out with affordable and easy-to-get mushroom options, but also entire ready-made cream of mushroom soups, it has established itself as a top dog, even if its popularity isn't quite what it used to be. When store-bought clothes and blankets were out of reach for many families, the motto was simple: use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without. Old coats, curtains, and even burlap sacks were given new life as warm clothing or quilts. Worn-out trousers became patchwork blankets, while burlap sacks, sometimes dyed or embroidered, were transformed into dresses, aprons, or mittens. It was practical creativity at its finest, proving that fashion can indeed be forged from function. This was an art form born out of necessity. Many families turned to sewing and mending as a way to keep warm, using skills passed down through generations. A tattered curtain might be stitched into a winter coat, and an old coat's lining could become insulation for a quilt. Even the natural environment played a part. Burlap sacks, used to transport grains and produce, became a staple for rural families. This practice also brought families together. Children learned to sew alongside their parents, sharing in the process of turning scraps into survival. Today, the idea of upcycling fabrics has come full circle, with modern sustainability movements embracing what Depression-era families mastered out of sheer necessity. It turns out, the original thrift store chic was just a warm hug in disguise. Split pea cakes are another example of how often peas and beans were the saving grace of American households.